So I've been doing work into suicide and self-harm for, it's my 29th year. And my interest, so many of you here are maybe undergraduate students. And so that was my interest in suicide really began as an undergraduate, where I did work initially on depression. I did as my final year project, I did it on depression. And then ever since that, I planned to do a PhD on depression. But then as serendipity plays a role oftentimes, that I got accidental. I planned to do a PhD on depression, but there was no funding associated with that PhD. And then one summer, it was the summer of 1994, I got a call from a person who would end up being my PhD supervisor to offer me the opportunity of doing a PhD on suicide. And really, I haven't looked back ever since. So it's pretty funny how those decisions shape your life, and indeed it has shaped my life entirely. And indeed, really sadly, that person took his own life. And so what I've been trying to do over the last 28, 29 years is try to make sense of why people become suicidal and what we can do to help it. And Noel wasn't the only person I've lost to suicide. A very, very close friend of mine took her own life as well before Noel did. And so that's always highlighted to me the challenge we face as a field of trying to understand and prevent suicide. And also just remember that this is going to be a pretty intense 45 minutes or so, so please, if you feel you have to leave the room, just do that. That's absolutely fine. And there's obviously helplines, I'll put it up at the very end for those of you who are affected. Because every one of us have a story to tell about suicide, either directly or indirectly. I'll come back to that through you. So what I'm going to try and do for the next 40 or so minutes is talk about the work that we've been doing to try and disentangle this most complex of phenomenon. But really another key message I hope we'll take from today is the fact that that psychology is central to understanding suicide. And as I was about to say, just as we're about to turn on the mic, and it's just huge gratitude to our funders, both statutory, standard, Research Council funders, but as well as those who've been affected by suicide, who've directly funded our research. And without them, we wouldn't be able to do the work that we've been doing. And so, again, as Chris mentioned, a lot of what I'll talk about is included in my book, When It's Darkest. And so, during COVID, I'd always been thinking about writing a book to summarize bring together, I suppose, what I've learned at that stage over the last 25 years in terms of understanding and preventing suicide, but also bring together that professional knowledge with my own personal reflections, including my own bereavements, as I've just touched on, as well as the countless people I have met on my journey. And so what When It's Darkest is written for the general public, and it tries to synthesize, bring together both those professional and professional perspectives. But again, a lot of it I'll touch on in the presentation tonight. So broadly speaking, I'll highlight something about the scale of the challenge we face in terms of preventing suicide. I will then move on to really the heart of the model of the talk is a model of suicide I've developed, the integrated motivational volitional model, a psychological model, or the IMV model, which is my attempt to try and understand the emergence of suicidal thoughts, as well as understand who is more likely to cross a precipice from suicidal thinking to suicidal acts. And that will be then the main bit. We'll focus in on that transition, which is really fundamental. Indeed, I think that's probably the most important and challenging question we have in trying to understand suicide. Lots of people have thoughts of suicide. Thankfully, the majority of people who have thoughts of suicide don't act on those thoughts. But there still is a sizable proportion, we think it's about a third, 30%, of people do make that transition from thoughts to acts. So the model is trying to understand that as well. And then I'll just bring it to a close, focusing on what we can all think about doing. We all have a role to play in understanding and preventing suicide. And I'll hone in on safety planning, sort of some brief intervention-based work that we've been doing. And just before we get into some more details on the scale of the challenge, as you'll see from the talk, at Glasgow, what we do the whole range of research in terms of understanding and preventing suicide. So we do experimental-based work, and I'll touch on some of that briefly, to try and understand the mechanisms. We also do large-scale epidemiological research, both with clinical and non-clinical populations, to try and understand who is most vulnerable and when. And we also do interventions-based work, working with people often within hours of a suicide attempt to try and work out what we can do best to intervene to save their lives. And so you'll get a sense of the different types of work we do over the next, 30 or 40 minutes. So in terms of the scale of the challenge, there's lots of different ways in which we can think about the scale of suicide. This slide is really helpful because it really starkly illustrates the public health challenge of suicide and suicide prevention. So there's different ways you can talk about it. 1 in 100 deaths globally, 1 in every 100 deaths globally is by suicide. So that's 703,000 people die by suicide somewhere in the world, across the world every year. In England or across the UK, it's about 6,000. In Scotland, it's between 700 and 800 deaths per year. And every one of those deaths obviously represents a huge tragedy. And we often also talk about the sort of ripples of suicide beyond those who die by suicide. And the estimates are now that, our best estimates suggest that for every person on average who dies by suicide, upwards of 135 people may have known that person in some shape or form. Now, of course, not all of those 135 will be bereaved in the traditional sense, but potentially affected. So if you then scale that up, that means every year, upwards of 90 million people may be affected by suicide each and every year. And that doesn't even take into consideration the numbers of people who attempt suicide. And again, there's different statistics. Some statistics suggest at least 20 times the number of people who die by suicide engage in non-fatal suicidal behaviour. So then that moves us on. We've got some sense of the scale of the challenge. And during COVID, thankfully, the suicide rates didn't, on the whole, increase. But the sad reality is now in countries like the UK, United States, New Zealand, Australia, we've started to see the suicide rates increase again. So in Scotland, we had a period in which the suicide rates were decreasing, but sadly, they went up a little last year. And there's a complex set of reasons why that's the case, but in part that will be linked to the cost of living crisis. So although suicide can and does affect anybody, there is a huge socioeconomic gradient. You're at least three times more likely to die by suicide if you're from a more socially disadvantaged background compared to a more affluent background. But as you'll see from the model of suicide I propose, suicide can and does affect anybody. But before I go into the detail of the IMV model to try and understand the psychology of suicide risk, I want to give you a sense of the scale of the different types of risk factors that impact on suicide risk. So this again is something published with colleagues in Canada and elsewhere before the pandemic, and it's just really giving you a biopsychosocial overview of the different domains of suicide risk. And you can see, excuse me, you see, as the name suggests, there are biological vulnerability factors. There, of course, are social vulnerability factors. I've already mentioned inequality and disadvantage. And of course, there are psychological factors, and I'll really focus in on those in a second. But when we're understanding suicide risk, it's really important we take a lifespan perspective. And so we've got here early life adversity, and I'll touch on some of the work we've been doing looking at this. But you'll see there's very clear evidence that people who experience early life trauma are at increased risk of poor mental health and increased risk of suicide. I don't know what, I've got a frog in my throat. I'll try and get rid of it. Why do people say, I've got a frog in my throat? Where does that come from? Does anybody know? Where does it come from? No takers. Thanks, I'll go home now. That seems a bit better. Right, so I'll return to the early life adversity in a second. But we also, in terms of biological effects, we've got what are known as epigenetic effects. There's growing evidence that early life trauma turns on and off genetic expression, genes, and that can also increase vulnerability. And we've got a whole range of other factors. We've got impulsivity, I'll maybe touch on that later. We've got substance misuse, we've got mental health problems. And of course, or it's called here psychopathology in this model. And of course, in Western countries, suicide is most commonly occurs in individuals who are experiencing a mental health crisis. And it's most commonly depression. But one of the really important messages is that mental illness or mental health problems do not explain why people die by suicide. The overwhelming majority of people who die by suicide, the overwhelming majority of people who are treated for depression never become suicidal and will never die by suicide. Does anybody any ideas of what percentage do you think of people who are treated for depression end their life? Should we just show a couple of percentages? 5? 1? 7? I like precision. 10? So that's in around the ballpark. It's about 4%. Right? So think about it then. The overwhelming majority of people with depression never become suicidal, never die by suicide. 96% don't kill themselves. And so what my model of suicide is going to try and highlight is what are then the key drivers for suicide risk. Now, that's not the same as saying that you shouldn't treat mental health problems, because of course you have to treat mental health problems. But it's not a specific enough marker. That's the point I'm making. And you need to look at beyond one risk factor. There's always a range of factors highlighted here which illustrate that complexity. And then I'll just highlight one other thing. So really what I'm going to focus in on for the remainder of the talk is what we're trying to do when we're trying to understand suicide risk is to identify a particular type of dysregulated mood, often which is characterized by hopelessness, but in particular by a state of entrapment, being trapped by that mental pain. And in essence, the reason people become suicidal is because they're trapped either by mental pain going on inside their heads or feel trapped by life circumstances. And if you're trying to tackle suicide risk, that's what you need to tackle. You need to understand what's driving that sense of entrapment. And that's what my model, which is going to come up in the next slide, is going to help us understand. And then the last bit is just, again, highlighting this other message, is that, yes, these are factors that lead you to becoming suicidal. Then you have to understand what are the factors which are most important in understanding this transition from thoughts to suicidal acts. So with that broad overview of illustrating this range of factors implicated in suicide risk, I would also argue that suicide is ultimately a psychological phenomenon because an individual makes a decision to end their life. Then that's not the same as making a choice, because the pain is so overwhelming. And often the person feels a burden on those around them, and actually they think, that's the way to end my pain. That's the way to end the pain and suffering of those around me. And it's that tunnel vision which drives to the suicidal thoughts. But what you'll see in a second, there are a group of factors which help us better understand who's more likely, if you're feeling suicidal, to cross a precipice from thoughts to acts. It's also worth highlighting that although our knowledge and understanding of suicide has grown markedly in the last 25 years, our ability to predict who will die by suicide remains no better than chance. It's no better than the tossing of a coin. And that's for a whole range of reasons, but one of those reasons is that although every death by suicide is a personal tragedy, statistically, suicides are rare events. So in the UK, if you have a population of 100,000, what's the population of Dundee? 150,000, right? So if you're a population, so the risk rate for suicide in the UK is about 10 people in every 100,000. So then if I was then to scale it up in Dundee, if I look at the population of Dundee, about 15 people will take their own lives in that population in a particular period, in a year. And that's where the challenge is. You're trying to identify the 15 people, which makes it so difficult. But that's no reason why we shouldn't keep trying and protect the vulnerable. So then that brings me on to the model of suicide that I developed first in 2011, and then I updated it with my colleague Olivia Kirtley in 2018. And again, don't worry about any of the technical details, or some of the slides also include statistics. I'll highlight the key messages of those, so don't worry about getting the detail. But in essence, the IMV model was my attempt to do at least two things. One is to understand the emergence of suicidal thoughts, as I've said already. And then the second thing is to better understand who's more likely to act on their thoughts. And so the model is in three parts. On the left-hand side, you've got the pre-motivational phase, which is simply the background context in which suicidal thoughts and behaviours may emerge. So you'll see there we've got things, diathesis. So diathesis is just another word for vulnerability. And those vulnerability factors could be like personality type factors. I'll speak about perfectionism shortly. Or it could be biological vulnerability factors. We know that some brain metabolites, we know that aspects of the of biological markers are in terms of linked to impulsivity are associated with suicide risk. And we also know, as I mentioned already, there's huge environmental influences. I mentioned the inequality dimension. And we also know that people who die by suicide have experienced a disproportionate number of negative life events, both in early childhood as well as throughout the lifespan. And what I'll return to later in the talk is understanding that our stress system becomes dysregulated. If we repeatedly hammer our stress system, we need cortisol to be released to help us manage stressful and threatening situations. But what you'll see in a few slides' time is that people who are suicidal, their stress system is dysregulated. It's not acting as well as it should do. But then if we get into the heart of the model, is part 2 and then part 3 on the right-hand side. Part 2 is called the motivational phase. And it's very simply trying to understand what factors lead people to become suicidal. And in a very simple way, the argument is people are more likely to have thoughts of suicide when they feel defeated and or humiliated from which they cannot escape. So it's that co-presence of defeat and or humiliation in which you feel trapped by, and that's what's the sort of the key substrate which leads to suicidal thoughts. Now, of course, what leads people to feel defeated or humiliated could be rejection, shame, or loss. And although I argue that these factors are central to understand the emergence of suicidal thoughts, each pathway is unique. Each individual's pathway to feeling trapped is unique. So for one person, it could be early life trauma. For somebody else, it could be living with severe mental illness, or unemployment, or bullying, or relationship breakdown. So when you're trying to understand suicide risk, the question becomes, what are the factors that lead people to feel defeated and humiliated from which they cannot escape? And there's a range of other factors which, if you're interested to learn more, if you go to our website, suicideresearch.info, all of our papers and podcasts and so on and videos are available to describe the model in more detail. So the first take-home message from the model is suicidal thoughts are the drivers for those are defeat and humiliation from which you feel entrapment. And then I'm going to return to, later in the talk in a few slides' time, is understanding this transition. Because this transition from thoughts to suicidal behaviour is governed by what I describe as the volitional phase. And you'll see that there are 8 factors that I propose are important in understanding that transition. And we've done work with thousands of people who are suicidal in clinical samples and non-clinical samples. And in every one of those studies, you have high levels of entrapment in people who attempted suicide or have suicidal thoughts. So then an obvious question is, well, how do we go about assessing entrapment? And we used to use this 16-item scale, the entrapment scale, which was developed by a colleague in down south called Paul Gilbert and Steve Allen. But what we published again during COVID was a brief version of this scale, a 4-item version, which is tapping 2 components of entrapment. You've got internal entrapment and you've got external entrapment. And internal entrapment are basically, I feel trapped inside myself, I feel I'm in a deep hole I can't get out of. And then these are the external entrapment items. And for the psychometrics people in the room, when we looked at the correlations between people's performance in these 4 questions compared to the 16 questions, the correlations range between 0.95 and 0.97. So what really means that we can measure entrapment as well with 4 questions rather than 16. So again, we're encouraging more and more people in clinical settings and in research settings to use this brief scale. And I would urge anybody who's working clinically with somebody who's suicidal, be monitoring people's levels of entrapment. Because they wax and wane. Suicidal thoughts wax and wane in periods of intensity and then they relent. Entrapment the same. And so what we're trying to understand is when are people most likely to feel entrapped? So we can identify again who is most vulnerable. And also you then can ask yourself, well, what are the factors? If you can measure entrapment, you can then start to ask people, what are the factors that lead you to feeling entrapped? And then what can we do to either intervene in a cognitive behavioral therapeutic way or in a social context way? So that's just how we might measure it using a standard scale. But in some of our qualitative work in which we speak to people who are suicidal, here's a brilliant study a colleague, Hazel Marsetti, did as part of her PhD. She did this detailed set of interviews with young people, LGBTQI plus young people, and asked them to talk about their suicidal distress and what the drivers to that were. And one of the things which emerged, this brilliant quote from Lily here, is what Hazel described as queer entrapment. And it's a brilliant example in which queer phobic conflict about their identity was a driver to this sort of internalized homophobia in a way, as well as but that's driven by, in this case, you can see here, their parents' attitudes towards their gender identity or sexual identity. So you can get a brilliant quote from Lily here. There have been times when I've just been like, oh, if I just ended my life, it would just stop everything. No one would have to deal with it. No one would have to be like, oh, we've got a gay daughter. No one would have to deal with it. It would just stop all the problems. I felt like that was the only way out of it all. Just like to disappear. Again, really powerful, very specific example. And if we think about any other minority groups, you can see that any minority groups on the whole, not exclusively, but broadly speaking on the whole, we experience much more minority stress, much more likely to feel trapped, and then you're trying to understand how do we intervene to tackle this. Because there's obviously, this is not Lily's problems, this is society's problem, and basically leading to this homophobic beliefs and leading to then this internal pain. So that was just 2 examples of how we assess entrapment quantitatively in our studies, as well as a really lovely example from Lily of how she describes her own sense of entrapment, being trapped by her identity. But the IMV model, as I've just described, also forms the basis of, last year, the Scottish Government published its 10-year strategy to an action plan to prevent suicide. And what underpins the strategy is the IMV model. And so the question we're now asking at all levels, from the government right down to individuals and communities, is a policy, for example, at a government level, does a policy contribute to people feeling resilient, better, valued? Or is a policy contributing to people feeling defeated, humiliated, shamed, and trapped? And there's people, sadly, who still present to clinical services and their experience is really negative. That they leave the clinical service not feeling that they're a waste of space and they're taking up beds and spaces of others. So what's good though is Scotland is trying to look differently, again using the IMV model to help us understand that. Okay, so thus far we've highlighted the importance of entrapment as a key driver. Before I return to this crossing the thoughts to action precipice, an obvious question might be, well, what might increase your sensitivity to feelings of defeat and entrapment? And a thing we've been doing a lot of work on for the last 20 years is a particular type of perfectionism called social perfectionism. And it's a personality characteristic. And I'll give you the formal definition in a second, but the formal definition, or what it basically assesses is the expectations you think other people in your life have of you. So important people like your parents, your partner, your friends, your colleagues, And if you score really high in social perfectionism, it's this idea that I describe it in When It's Darkest in my book, I describe it as having very thin psychological skin. And so that every day is a repeated opportunity for you to think you're letting others down. And it's like, so when the bows and arrows of life come at you, they're much more likely to pierce your skin, lead to psychological distress, compared to somebody who's low in social perfectionism, who's less concerned about the expectations of others. I score really high in social perfectionism, and many of us do. And in and of itself, social perfectionism is not bad, but it's a potential vulnerability factor when you put it in the mix of a whole set of factors. And again, we've done work looking at this social perfectionism. Here's the formal definition. So he taps these beliefs about excessive, often unrealistic expectations about we perceive significant others, so other people in our life have of us. So they're not grounded in reality. It's like in psychological terms, we describe it as a metacognition. It's a thought about a thought. And that's why it's so dangerous, because it's outside of our control in our head, because we think it's somebody else has this belief or expectation. And again, we've done lots of work on this with adolescents in schools, right through to adults from disadvantaged and affluent backgrounds, clinical and non-clinical, literally tens of thousands of people. And you always see high levels of social perfectionism is associated with poor mental health, self-harm, and suicide risk. So that's just an example of how, and the other thing, the reason I put it up in answer to the question of how it increases sensitivity is because when we've done the analyses, people who score high in social perfectionism are much more likely to report higher levels of defeat, higher levels of rejection, and higher levels of entrapment. So it's like this sort of a mediator in psychological terms of increasing risk. During COVID, we also did a lot of work looking at loneliness as another really important social factor associated with suicide risk. And with a colleague, Heather McClellan, we published this is a meta-analysis. So this is a summary of all the studies out there at the time looking at the relationship between loneliness and suicide risk. And again, don't worry about the details. The key message is that loneliness, as another really important social factor, is people who attempt suicide, people who think about suicide, report significantly higher levels of loneliness. And again, we think about that in the context of COVID. Although the suicide rates didn't increase during COVID, rates of suicidal thoughts, rates of suicide attempts, as in particular amongst young people, did increase. And part of that mechanism might be the increase in loneliness. And in another study that Heather did, and again, don't worry about all the graphs here, there's a study in which we're looking at, this is university students, and this is university students here who report high levels of entrapment and high levels of loneliness, and you see this conjoined effect because they report the highest levels of suicidal ideation. And the reason that is important to highlight is because what it's telling us is that if you're trying to reduce suicidal thinking in this population, you need to tackle loneliness and you need to tackle entrapment separately. So it's just giving you an idea about the sort of different sorts of work we're doing to try and understand a wide range of factors: perfectionism, loneliness, entrapment, defeat, and the list goes on and on. Another thing I want to just move on to before I return to this transition from thoughts of suicide to suicidal acts is that the stark reality is, in Scotland, the majority of people who die by suicide are men. 3/4 of all suicides are by men. So then what we looked at to ask ourselves was, actually, if 3/4 of all suicides are by men, how many of the studies out there are actually looking at male suicide? There should be loads, but there's not. There just isn't, because men are less likely to take part in studies. And when we did, I'm going to show you 2 slides. One is a review of the world literature on looking at either studies which people were trying to predict suicidal behaviour over time or look back on it, right? So retrospective is the back, prospective is the forward. And we found just over 100 studies. And what was even more, and this is just a summary of it, this work led by Cara Richardson. But what's even more stark about this is most of the studies, don't worry about all the details again, this orange circle represents studies in which the focus is on social demographic factors, just understanding the social and demographic context of the population. Now, as I've tried to make the case, suicide is ultimately a psychological phenomenon. So there should be much more work under trying to understand the psychology of men and men's understanding and perception of their lives in their world, but there's very little. 6 studies. We could find 6 studies published anywhere, anytime in the world, looking at psychological factors predicting suicide risk in men only. Of course, there's lots of studies, and there's men and women and other genders included in the analyses, but they're often not large enough that you can disentangle what's male specific. And I think that's really important if we're to tackle the fact that 3/4 of all suicides are by men. We also looked at the qualitative literature. And this is just hot off the press. It's just out, published in Psychological Bulletin. Again, I'm not going to go through the details, but you can read the paper. It's freely available online. But this is a summary of the worldwide literature on interview-based studies with men who've thought about suicide, attempted suicide, or you've been bereaved by a male suicide. There's less than 100 studies here. I think it's 60, and it's in the 60s that we could find. Again, the worldwide literature. But what we've tried to do here is understand and develop a model of masculinity and masculine norms which are associated with both suicide risk and suicide recovery if you've been suicidal. And again, we described the first one, wrong way, the first one as the 3Ds model. The 3Ds model is really helping us understand dysregulated psychological pain, which is characteristic of male suicide risk, in terms of denial, dysregulation, and disconnection. And then when we look at recovery, we've got the 3Rs model. It's trying to recognition of what males' emotions are, regulate it, and then help with reconnection. And so this synthesis of the qualitative interview-based literature should hopefully inform interventions to protect those men who are vulnerable. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the sort of risk factors that lead to the emergence of suicidal thoughts. What I want to move on to now is go back to this transition from suicidal thinking to suicidal behaviour. And I already made the point that about 30% of people who have thoughts of suicide act on those thoughts, okay, engage in any form of suicidal behaviour. But I want to, before I go into the details of that, here's a quote from I talked to a mother I met a few years ago, and I write about her experience in When It's Darkest. And here are her words. "I never thought he'd do it. A few weeks before his death, he had told me that he had thoughts about being dead, but I was too scared to ask him directly whether he would kill himself. I haven't stopped asking myself why I didn't ask him. Not a day passes when I don't torment myself with this question. When I look back on it now, I just didn't think he was the type of person who would kill himself. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but he was just always so full of life." Utterly heartbreaking. But it's also really important for a couple of other points as well. That quote, it resonates with me as somebody who's lost 2 people in my life to suicide, and I blame myself still every day what I could have done differently. And I feel I'd let the families down, of my close friends in particular. But also it's about challenging the stereotypes around suicide. There's no face of somebody who dies by suicide. It could be any one of us. This head in the hands idea, yeah, for some people that might be the case, but for many it's not. So we need to look beyond these stereotypes. But in essence, this mother's quote is part of the reason why, when I was developing my model of suicide, I wanted to better understand this transition from thoughts to suicidal acts. And as I said already, the third bit of my model on the right-hand side, called the volitional phase, outlines these 8 key factors. And this is another way of representing that last bit of my model, the volitional phase. And so what we've got here is people who've thought about suicide or and suicidal intent. And over here, we've got people who've engaged in suicidal behaviour. And the model argues that there are 8 key factors here which help us understand that transition. So if you think about it, if you're having thoughts of suicide and you've ready access to the means of suicide, you're more likely to act. It's the same as any other behaviour. If you basically have ready access to anything, it facilitates action. And conversely, if you can introduce environmental constraints, environmental barriers, cognitive barriers, psychological barriers more broadly, you'll reduce the likelihood that people will act on their thoughts. I won't go through them all tonight. And then another one would be, again, if you're thinking about suicide and you've known somebody, so exposure to suicide or suicidal behaviour, it's just another way for saying knowing somebody else who's died by suicide. So again, as I've said already, my risk is elevated because I know people close to me who've died by suicide. But it's really important to put that in context. Although it's a risk factor, it's a statistical risk factor. The overwhelming majority of people who are bereaved by suicide will never become suicidal and will certainly never die by suicide. But it's important we remember it though. Impulsivity, again, stands to reason. If you're having thoughts of suicide and you're impulsive, you're more likely to act on your thoughts, carry out your intentions. These two you may be less familiar with. These two, physical pain sensitivity and fearlessness about dying and death, are thought to characterize what a colleague in the United States, Thomas Joyner, talks about as having the capability for suicide. And the physical pain tolerance is you oftentimes have to overcome the physical pain that's required to carry out the suicidal act. And if you couple that with then overcoming the life instinct, the fearlessness about dying, your risk is elevated. Again, at Glasgow, we've been doing some experimental based work in the lab, bringing people who are suicidal into the lab to try and understand their physical pain sensitivity and how that changes under different circumstances. And then the last couple, mental imagery. Again, if you're having thoughts of suicide and if you're picturing yourself dying or dead, you're more likely to act on your thoughts. It's like a habituation process or a modeling sort of process. And then the last one, the single best predictor of any future behaviour is past behaviour. So if anybody's engaged in any form of previous suicidal behaviour, they're statistically at increased risk of dying by suicide in the future. Although, again, it's really important to put that in context, the overwhelming majority of people who attempt suicide don't die by suicide. Okay? Most make a full recovery. And again, if you want to know more, go to our website. There's lots of studies in which we've shown that these factors here, these volitional phase factors, are key to understanding that transition. Defeat and entrapment are important in understanding the emergence of suicidal thoughts, whereas these factors are important to understand that transition from thoughts to acts of suicide. Okay, so what I want to move on to now is there's 2 last bits of the talk. The first is on some of our stress work, and then I'll just end with some of the interventions-based work and that safety planning I touched on, I mentioned at the start. So I've started to make the case here for the importance of looking at the stress response, the fight or flight response. When we encounter a stressful or threatening situation, we need cortisol to be released to help us either flee that situation or stand and fight. And the cortisol is also important with decision making, emotion regulation, and problem solving. 3 really important processes when you think about suicide risk. And I'm going to just outline a typical study we do looking at cortisol, and I'll show you some results. So in our experimental based work, what we do is we can assess cortisol in saliva, and we can bring people into the lab, and so often we bring people with 3 groups of people into the lab. People who have never been suicidal, so like our controls. People who have thought about suicide, so the ideation group, and those who have attempted suicide. And what you're going to see in a second is, when we do our experimental work, what we do is they all get a baseline assessment of cortisol to start before we do anything, any intervention. But then what we can do is we can induce stress in the laboratory. And there's a way in which we can do that, which we know activates the stress system. And what we're looking for is, we're looking for cortisol. When we do the stress induction, we're looking for the cortisol to increase. In the control population, if I stress you out, you should see cortisol increase and then recover. But what you'll see in a couple of slides' time is that's not what happens in people who are suicidal. You don't see this nice jump. It's a flattened response called a blunted cortisol response. They're not releasing the same amount of cortisol compared to the controls. And this is a study, and you can see there's 2 O'Connors on this. I have an identical twin brother who's also a psychologist, convenient, and a stress researcher. So this is work I do with Darryl, and this is Darryl and I planning our research some years ago, and us more recently. And just as a one brief light moment of an aside, look at those knees. Those knees are nearly the same size of my whole waist. It's troubling. That's a troubling photograph. But anyway, the serious point is, so this is work Darryl and I do together, right? So so the other thing we've done, I'm going to show you 2 results in a second. Not only I'm going to show you this blunted cortisol response, but I'm also going to show you the relationship between cortisol and childhood trauma. And what you'll see in a second is, in these studies, we also assess childhood trauma. We ask people what trauma they'd experienced up to the age of 16, an age from 0 to 16. And what you'll see very, very clearly is the trauma people tell us they experienced as children, maybe 15 years ago, predicts how much cortisol they release in our life today. So it highlights the importance of taking that lifespan perspective. And so I'm just going to give you a couple of slides now just to illustrate this point, and then we'll move on to safety planning. So just to illustrate the strong relationship between childhood trauma and suicide risk. Again, this is another study of ours. I just want to draw your attention to this. This is the line of people who've attempted suicide. 80% of the people in our studies who've attempted suicide, not only have they been exposed to trauma, but trauma that we've categorized as moderate to severe. And we've since replicated that. It's not a one-off effect. It's really, really stark effect, the relationship between trauma, poor mental health, and suicide risk. So I'm now going to show you 2 other slides of results. One is looking at this when I do the stress induction, and you're going to see a line graph, and you'll see about 10 or 15 minutes in is when we do the stress induction. And what you'll see, if we just look at the red line, these are people who've attempted suicide. This when we do the stress induction, they've got the flattest response, really clearly. People who have control, they're releasing the most cortisol. I mean, you do all the controls you should do in these analyses, these effects hold. So clear evidence of dysregulation of the cortisol system implicated in suicide risk. Same graph, this time looking at trauma and cortisol. So again, we've got people here, no trauma history, medium exposure to trauma, high exposure. And this is only in people who've either been suicidal, either thought about suicide or attempted suicide. And again, I just want to highlight the key message here. That's the people with a high exposure to trauma. They're releasing the least amount of cortisol. Okay? So it's really important we think about this to take that lifespan perspective in terms of understanding suicide risk, but also looking at the interplay between trauma and suicide risk. Okay, so the last bit, probably do about 7 minutes, I think, and then we should have time for some questions. So I've made the case that it's really important to understand the factors that lead people to think about suicide, but then crucially then the factors that are associated with the transition from thoughts to action. So then if you think about suicide prevention, there's at least two things we can do to prevent suicide. We can stop people becoming suicidal in the first place. Huge challenge, especially if you think about inequality. Or we can try and interrupt the suicidal thoughts, interrupt the transition from thinking to action. And over the last 20 years, there's been a growth in interventions. Don't worry about all the details, but there's been a growth in both psychological and medication or pharmacological interventions associated with reduced suicidal risk. And like some of these will be familiar to you. So CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, very familiar. There's good evidence that it reduces suicidal behaviour. But there's also been growing interest in what are known as brief interventions. And I'm just going to say a few words about safety planning, because safety planning is widely used. It's a brief intervention, and it's something we've been doing work on in recent years. And so an obvious question is, well, what is safety planning? Well, so very simply, effectively, it's like a crisis plan. You're basically, or an emergency plan. What you're trying to do is, across 6 steps, which I'll show you in a second, across 6 steps you're trying to get people to identify the warning signs that a suicidal crisis might be emerging, and then, crucially, steps 2, 3, 4, and 5, identify people, activities, or places either to distract you from the escalating suicidal thoughts, or somewhere you can go, people, places, or activities to hopefully keep you safe. And then step 6 is, if all that else fails, try to get the person to agree that they will minimize their access to lethal means of suicide, to increase the distance between them and their method of suicide. And so this is the safety plan in essence, as I've just described. So it's really simple: warning signs, people and places and activities, crisis support, and then making the environment safe. And it's all evidence-based. The components of these are all evidence-based. And indeed, so what you're trying to do with a safety plan, very simply, is suicidal thoughts, as I mentioned already, come in waves. And so what you're hoping to do is that suicidal thoughts increase in intensity, but you're hoping that they de-escalate without a suicidal act happening. And so that is increased if you've got a safety plan. Because the concern is, without a safety plan, you're more likely to escalate. And again, over the last couple of years, with colleagues across Europe, we try to summarise the evidence base for whether safety planning interventions, and whether safety planning interventions were effective. And again, don't worry about the statistics, but there's clear evidence that that simple type intervention, as part of a range of other interventions, seems to be effective in de-escalating suicide risk. And then in Scotland, we did a study across the Central Belt, a feasibility study looking to see, could we embed safety planning with telephone support in hospitals in Scotland, basically, especially that when an individual is discharged from hospital following a suicide attempt, we offered weekly telephone calls for the next 45 weeks where risk of reattempt are highest. And could we do that in Scotland? And we could. This is with the 2 people who developed safety planning, Barbara Stanley, who died sadly this year, and Greg Brown. And the take-home message was, we tried to do this in Scotland. This isn't an efficacy trial. We can't say whether it's effective, but we know that it was feasible to embed it within the Scottish NHS. And moreover, in our intervention arm, so that's the people who were offered the safety plan, 6 in 10 of them told us in those 4 or 5 weeks when risk is high that they used a safety plan. So although it's not an efficacy trial, it seems to suggest that it's important and could have saved their lives in those weeks following discharge from hospital. So what that's to illustrate, the importance of safety planning is to illustrate or help us illustrate that although there's lots of complex set of factors associated with suicide risk, and some of the interventions are much more in-depth, like CBT or dialectical behaviour therapy, even small things can make a difference. And so as I just try and wind it up and bring the talk to a close, I often now talk about the 4 C's of suicide prevention. First C is compassion. Sadly, too often still, People who are suicidal or experiencing mental health crises aren't experiencing compassion when they encounter clinical services. Now, I've been involved in what's known as the Distress Brief Intervention Programme, which is now across Scotland, in which we're trying to embed compassion throughout in anybody who presents to a whole range of services like general practice, the emergency department, the police. We're trying to ensure that compassion is embedded in all responses they receive, and we're making progress in that regard. We should never forget the complexity of suicide prevention. Yeah, I've highlighted safety planning as one brief intervention. But the factors that lead to suicide there's never just one factor. Never, ever just one factor. If you read in the news that often used to be the case in bullying, you would see reports of people reported bullying, and that was seen as the single cause of suicide. It's never just a single cause. It could have been a really important factor, but it's bullying or another factor impacting on somebody who's already vulnerable, which is key. And then the last two, well, I'll do this one, to do care first. Care, we need to rethink our models of care, in particular when we think of male suicide. We know, of the list of interventions I put up on the slide earlier, there was no evidence at all that any of them work for men. We don't know whether CBT works for men in the context of suicide risk, because the studies have not been conducted. But the last point I want to leave you with is connection. Again, I talk about this in my book. I talk about people I've met on my journey, and small acts of kindness or reaching out to somebody when they're feeling particularly vulnerable was life-saving. Like small acts of, because remember, if somebody is in an acute suicidal state, they think they're worthless. They think the world would be a better off place without them in it. But a smile, a WhatsApp, a telephone call, anything reaches out, sort of tapping into that common humanity can save lives. And I think that although it doesn't matter for somebody like me who's been bereaved by suicide, and I think about what I could have done differently. But what we're all those who are bereaved or working, doesn't matter what your role is in suicide prevention, but every one of us in this room can do something which could save a life. So never underestimate that. The power of common humanity, of reaching out and treating somebody as a human being, could be the difference between living and dying. Thank you.